Viewers, we have all read at some point in our lives an NCERT textbook. It's the central authority in charge of designing the syllabus for academic study in educational institutions and has been in the news once again because it has carried out another round of deletions and alterations, this time in Class 12 political science textbooks. Because of the NCERT, viewers, and its decision to once again amend the curricula, what we now know is that Standard 12 political science booklets will no longer refer to the BJP's Rath Yatra from Somnath to Ayodhya. BJP's expression of regret, for example, over Ayodhya happenings. The phrase is Ayodhya happenings. There is no reference to the Babri Masjid demolition anymore. Communal violence after the Babri demolition. The textbooks are going to be silent on those instances. Newspaper clippings of the Babri demolition. In fact, the mosque itself is no longer going to be called the Babri Mosque. It is going to be called only the three-dome structure. References in textbooks to Muslims massacred in Gujarat riots has also been omitted. Azad Kashmir, the word, has been omitted from the political science text also, viewers. Achievements of Mughal emperors, president's rule in BJP-ruled states, all of these facts have now been pruned, deleted, removed. The decision to remove these events, some extremely consequential, has spawned a debate. And it would be fair to also say a backlash among sections of the intelligentsia and the opposition. Let me run you through some of the critics, viewers. Certain individuals have come out and said, like Jairam Ramesh, Congress Member of Parliament, and of course, the head of the communications department of the Congress party, that the NCERT must produce textbooks, not propaganda. That's what he said. Asaduddin Owaisi has come out and said children mustn't grow up glorifying criminal acts. Narrow ideological stance must not be taught. This is V. Sivakutty, who is the Kerala Education Minister. Is BJP ashamed of their history as criminals and rioters? Says the TMC Saket Gokhale. There are a number of others, viewers, who weighed in. Additionally, the NCERT director has defended the deletion, saying, quote, "Why should we teach about riots in textbooks? We want to create positive citizens, not violent and depressed individuals," unquote. Those opposed to the changes accuse the Premier Education Panel of sanitizing society and polity. There should be no attempt at, quote, infantilizing, unquote, the learner. One newspaper editorial, for instance, commented that the NCERT's director's comments reveal, quote, an overwhelming anxiety to present a picture of a sanitized society and polity by papering over fault lines and events that are constitutive of a nation's journey and even its learning arc, unquote. While there can be no quibble with this argument, we cannot allow ourselves to be selective about when we bring ourselves to interrogate the paternalism of the Indian state. If we object to our children getting a sanitized view of, for instance, quote, three-dome structure, unquote, that once towered over the Ram Janambhoomi, then we should also be as censorious about the paternal state's silence over the oppressive psychological and material impact that Muslim settler colonialism and latter-day separatism had and has on Hindus. How we come to terms with our past will determine how we shape our present and future. Despite the logical infallibility of this cliche, those that shaped our textbooks in the early years of the Republic saw our past through an ideologically jaundiced lens. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar was a strident critic of the organized effort of the intellectual class when it came to papering over the Hindu-Muslim fault line that palpably ran through the polity. At the time, this secularization of India's history was deemed important in the, quote, interests of national unity, unquote, and that the, quote, needs of a modernizing society should be the primary considerations in our choice and presentation of material, unquote. Had this not been stated for the record in the shape of a recommendation made by the Committee on School Textbooks of the Government of India in 1969, it would have been denied viewers. In hindsight, the, quote, composite culture, unquote, narrative insulated generations of Indians from facts that have deeply affected their ability to make informed ideological choices, especially when it comes to exercising their franchise, selecting their representatives, or the government. Would, for instance, those that today lament the NCERT's alleged, quote, course correction, unquote, stand up for a genuine rewrite of India's textbook history, incorporating some of the more painful aspects of settler colonization? One seriously doubts it, given how they express themselves, viewers, in the present day. But let me not continue with this monologue. Let me open this up to an informed discussion. We have with us Anand Nilkantan, an author. We also have with us Vinay Sahasrabuddhe, former Rajya Sabha Member of Parliament and, of course, the President of the Indian Council for Cultural Relations, or the ICCR. Professor Chandan Gowda, another noted author and academic, is with us. Let me begin with you first, Mr. Sahasrabuddhe. Look, one can lament the fact that those that came before us did not do justice to history in the manner that would have been a faithful recollection of some of the more, how should one put it, dramatic events that shaped the nation. But does that mean that the NCERT should go about deleting certain important milestones in the construction of what is our extant political history?
See, one thing is there that NCERT textbooks should not be seen as the only repository of the historical facts of our country. There are many more history books, and NCERT just provides a kind of a window to look at the history for the school children at a particular juncture, in a particular standard, in a particular class, and it also kind of summarizes the whole thing and presents it in a nutshell. If we have to suggest that whatever NCERT says is the only history, I believe we are being naive and innocent. I mean, one should not be looking at it from this angle. And therefore, it is very appropriate that NCERT has decided to balance out the things and present a more sanitized version of our history. When I say balance out, there was a clear imbalance in the past, and I was chairing the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Education 2 years before, in 2021, and that time we had taken up the subject of textbook reforms, and close to 8 months we had deliberated on that. Several meetings happened. We visited several centers, also interacted with not just teachers, students and historians, but others also, those who wanted to, I mean, those who were at the think tanks and who were desirous of presenting their views before the committee while deposing. And many glaring imbalances we had pointed out. And one of the strongest recommendation of the committee was, and I am now quoting the committee report, the committee, in the context of unequal representation of various periods and dynasties in the history textbooks by the stakeholders, observes that NCERT should take a re-look at the guidelines for the writing of the history textbooks so that equal weightage and importance is given to the various eras, periods and events in the history textbooks. Similarly, it was observed that school textbooks do not give adequate coverage to some of the great Indian empires like that of Vikramaditya, Cholas, Chalukyas, Vijayanagar, Gondwana, and that of the Travancore and Ahoms of the northeast India. I mean, it's a statement of fact. It was never considered by the NCERT. In fact, I must share here with the audience that a class 7 boy expressed his desire to depose before the committee. And in the history of our parliament, perhaps he was the youngest person allowed by the committee to depose before it, because he had written a textbook by himself. And he has said that whatever I am being told in my class through the history textbooks is totally different than whatever information I get in the public sphere. And therefore he said that, for example, about Mughal era and kings or rulers like Aurangzeb and Akbar, if there are 4 pages of material which I have to go through, there are references to Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj in just 5 lines and to Maharana Pratap in just 3 lines. And this is what he presented before us, and it was a statement of fact. And therefore, we mentioned it, we clearly recommended it, and I believe the NCERT is acting in the light of the recommendations of the Parliamentary Standing Committee. And I must mention over here that the committee composition, as it happens, consists of all shades of opinion, all ideologies, and the report was a kind of unanimous set of recommendations by the committee. And therefore, I see nothing wrong in whatever the corrections that the NCERT people are now making in the history textbooks.
Okay, so thank you for that overview. Let me bring in Professor Gowda. Professor Gowda, there are 2 issues here. Number one, as Mr. Sahasrabuddhe has explained to us, look, these changes have not been ad hoc. They have gone through a cogitative process, fairly consensuous process from a standing committee of parliament that had wide representation, number one. And therefore, there's nothing really wrong in bringing out all shades and correcting the imbalance. So that's one. And secondly, of course, that, look, in the words of the director itself, the NCERT director, that why should we teach about riots in textbooks? And if we have to, then we should cast the lens wider, the net wider, and include all shades of rioting, etc. How do you respond?
Rahul, the consensus you talked about is seen within a committee that was assembled by the government. So it's not, in the standing committee of the parliament, I'm not sure if all parties were represented or if even were consulted, because you quoted Jairam Ramesh earlier on. I don't think he would have responded that way if the Congress MPs were also in the standing committee. Be that as it may, coming to the second point, Rahul, I think there's extraordinary naivete in how it's being talked about. You can't say in discussing riots in a books. I read the NCERT director's response in the newspapers. He said they will teach students to, indulge in rioting, or they become, they feel like becoming hateful, etc. For me, the textbooks are actually making them aware of unfortunate incidents that ought not to be repeated. One. And secondly, it's not true that only these riots, the Gujarat riots or the other riots that you mentioned earlier are the only ones mentioned here. The previous chapters talk about the Sikh riots. They talk about the emergency. They talk about violent incidents seen all through independent India. And it's simply incorrect to think certain incidents are being singled out. And if I may respond to the predecessor's comments, sitting in Bangalore, we have always felt that students grow up in Bangalore with NCERT books with zero knowledge of Karnataka. There's nothing about Karnataka kings. There's very little about Karnataka politics. In fact, it's bizarre why the books are even being used here. And I'm sure it's the same with students in Tamil Nadu and Kerala and Andhra Pradesh. It's just a question of time before more and more people line up talking about exclusions. And something is to be said in favor of a democratic discussion of how Indian politics and history is being represented in these books. And by the way, hundreds of books may be available on Indian history and culture, but these books matter more than anything else, if you ask me, because lakhs and lakhs of Indian students encounter these books in their classrooms as a matter of their formal educational upbringing. And this is the India they encounter. And it matters a great deal how truly and correctly facts are represented. and present it to them. I think it's an act of great responsibility. It's possible. I'm not saying the books in their current form are great or perfect or exemplary. And I'm sure all books are open to revision in the sense that new arguments will make us look at issues differently. But the committee has to be super responsible because we're really talking about a large country like India that's committed to being a democratic country.
Okay, before I bring in Mr. Neelakantan, let me just go back to Vinay Sahasbuddhe because he was a member of that committee. And since Mr. Gowda, you raised questions about its inclusivity, etc., let him respond. It's only fair that he does so. What was the composition? Was it truly representative? Was it, censorious of the opposition's point of view, etc.?
I must very humbly put it that every parliamentary standing committee consists of members of all political parties. And it was not just Rajya Sabha committee, it was a committee represented by Lok Sabha members as well. And there were people from practically all the political parties, and therefore even Congress members were there, communist members were there, and there is no record to suggest that they have given a kind of a dissent note or a separate note or any difference of opinion they have pointed out. So I believe there is absolutely no evidence to suggest that there was only one political party that carried out the entire content of the report, and therefore it is certainly not factual. Our learned members in this panel must be aware that all parliamentary standing committees are representative committees where every political party, generally speaking, gets representation.
Okay, so let me now bring in Mr. Neelakantan and we'll move to the second aspect of this debate. But before we do that, Mr. Neelakantan, Professor Gowda sort of said that, look, we should not insulate our students from certain facts. There might be troubling facts, but because we are laying the foundation for future knowledge in students in class 12, etc., they should be brought up to speed with the full panoply of happenstances, so to speak, that have shaped our polity. And principle, there's nothing wrong with that. How would you respond to this?
Basically, I think I partially agree with Sahasrabuddhe sir when he said that there has been a lot of bias in history writing. And as Mr. Gowda pointed out, the south and the east of the country has been very underrepresented when we are teaching history. Whatever history we learned relatively a minor dynasty of Lodhis more than what Rashtrakutas or Cholas or Cheras had done. We learned more about because it was more a Delhi-centric history. A Lodhi dynasty, if you see, it is more of a very provincial Panchayat dynasty. But we learned more chapters about it rather than the Rashtrakutas who ruled almost half of India or Cholas who ruled half of Asia. So that kind of bias was always there. And apart from that, as a part of perhaps the nation building or misguided priorities, in the initial years when the history was made, a lot of things were glozed over, including one of the most bloodiest invasions in the human history, that of Islamic invasion. Everything was glozed over, and many of the riots were glozed over. Many of the controversial things were glozed over earlier also, like the caste system, the impact of caste system on a large section of society, that was glozed over. Now, we are attempting to correct it, but in that attempt, I think we are going to the other extreme and trying to put a totally opposite shade and repeating the same kind of mistake from the other side. We cannot, if you don't teach history properly and try to censure it like how we are doing now, until then I had agreed with Sahasrabuddhe sir, but where I disagree is this. If you don't talk about the riots which happened after the Babri Masjid, if you don't talk about the demolition of the structure, the students will definitely learn it, but they will learn it from other sources. There might be very inauthentic sources from YouTube videos, from social media and various other things, and it will create more trouble rather than allowing them to discuss, debate and learn from that. So we cannot gloss over certain aspects of history, just like how we had tried to gloss over a lot of defects in our society and a lot of violence which happened during the Islamic era or the colonial era or the interracial troubles which we had during the partition. We had glozed most of them, and the emergency we glozed over them, just like how the previous regimes had done. Now this regime is also trying to gloss over the certain things which they are not comfortable with. So we are doing the same mistake, whether you are doing it through the left side of it or the right side of it, the students are the losers of it.
All right, so Abhishek, the question that I was asking is that last year around only, within a year only, we have seen a major spur in the bilateral activities between the two nations. How Prime Minister of Bangladesh has been inclined towards BJP-led government and Prime Minister Modi's leadership. At the same time, we saw on March 18th also there was this friendship pipeline which was inaugurated by two of the leaders. How this time around when she has come after Modi 3.0, it's going to give some sort of a signal about new policies, new schemes coming into the picture with both the leaders, with both the nations?
Well, the two sides have been keen on having new areas of cooperation. We know that India and Bangladesh, they have been having some cooperation in the sector of renewable energy, and energy imports also from India. Bangladesh is with a growing economy. Bangladesh needs a lot of energy resources, and they have had some agreement with India and Indian companies also. That would mean that energy and electricity produced in India will be exported to Bangladesh. Currently, the two sides are having a bilateral trade.
Let me bring in Abbas Maldiyar, who also joins us, and he's written a book on Babur. Whether we like it or not, Mr. Maldiyar, the NCERT has taken a bit of a dim view of the Mughal contribution. In fact, they have minimized the contribution of the Mughals in some ways in the textbooks, especially that which relate to class 12. So I want to begin with the first Mughal that you've written about, Babur, since the Babri Masjid itself is now being referred to as a three-dome structure in the NCERT books, etc. First of all, do you think the Mughals are worthy of having been sort of edified to the point that they have been not just in our textbooks, but also in the national imagination? We have roads named after several of the Mughals, etc., without context, of course. So I just want to get a sense from you about Babur, since you've written that very well appreciated book.
First of all, thank you, Rahul, for having me. Indeed, what you are pointing out is very pertinent, that is it really wise enough to have the Mughals be sung through a lot of glories? So as a biographer of Babur, I would say that surely there were not many contribution of the man as he has been portrayed as. Like Pandit Nehru, in fact, went on to say him as one of the man who was the best in art, culture, and perhaps you can meet the best gentleman or the man of a culture as how Nehru saw him as. But the reality which comes through the original text, say the Baburnama, is very different, because Babur was certainly very barbaric to his nature. He not only killed the Hindus, but he also killed a lot of Muslims while he was entering into Afghanistan. And mostly the Mughals are emphasized for having given us a lot of architecture, having given us a lot of art, culture, tradition. But is it really true? It's really far from reality. Because if I again pick the original text, that is Baburnama itself, Babur himself is saying that to build one of the largest structure of Samarkand, which was the mausoleum of Taimur, for that 100 artisans were brought from India. So it's happening even a few centuries before Babur entered into Hindustan. So they definitely didn't have that much sense of architecture as the people like to show them as. And surely we did not glorify the people who butchered, who massacred, and who did everything what the worst could happen to our culture and tradition. And in fact, just taking the clue, or rather picking up from where Nehruji had said that Babur was perhaps one of the most gentleman or the man of the culture. He didn't destroy anything like his ancestor, as Pandit Nehru said. But the reality is that just on the eve of Battle of Khanwa, he broke the vessels of alcohol while he was denouncing alcohol. And he said that I'm going to destroy the idols of the pagans, that is Hindus, exactly how I have destroyed these vessels of the alcohol. So kind of metaphor what he was bringing, that gives you a sense that what kind of hatred he had for the indigenous people of Bharat or India. So it surely is not something which we need to glorify. And most of the things what we find in NCERT books or the text which I had read, in fact I also read the NCERT books and most of the youths are still reading them. It's all about over-glorification of these invaders. They mostly sing the song which actually never existed. They tell us something which was never there on the surface. It is always far from the reality. We really need to retrospect that how we look at the Mughal history, because if we don't tell the history as it is, it's not that we are not supposed to talk about them. We surely need to talk about them, because you need to know as much of heroes as much you need to know about the villains. It's very important.
Okay.
And I use the term villain because surely who destroyed my culture cannot be hero ever, irrespective of how much people may try to make a hero out of them.
Okay, let me bring in, for the last 3 or 4 minutes that we have left on the show, 2 other panelists, Professor Gowda as well as Mr. Vinay Sahasrabudhe. Professor Gowda, I just want to ask you this, because our textbooks also taught us that Muslims were welcomed in India by Hindu rulers who permitted them to build mosques and spread their teachings. Now, I'm quoting straight out of a report of University Education Commission led by Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan in 1948 regarding aims of university education in India. So there was this, as Dr. Ambedkar said, this championing of this composite culture, which sort of has given us a false impression of that sort of golden age, the medieval era, especially in the north.
Rahul, I'm sure you've read James Joyce's Ulysses. It's a 700-page novel, right? It's an account of 1 or 2 days.
Yeah.
So we're talking about centuries here. And the Mughal rule has got the attention it has got because the Mughal dynasty was in Delhi for 250 years almost. It's a large chunk of time. It's not an accident that they have got the attention that they've got. Other dynasties that rule for a smaller bits of time haven't been able to get that kind of attention. And it is absolutely true that the achievements are spectacular. They're rare to see. You take a walk in Delhi, you see them at every corner. Anyway, but going to history to look at pluses and minuses is a terrible way of understanding history, because every empire will have pluses and minuses. You cannot found an empire on non-violence. There's enormous violence. Go to the neighboring empire, a smaller kingdom, to see how they viewed the king. Shivaji may be a hero, but the people he vanquished, I'm sure, didn't see him as a hero. Right? I mean, it's the logical question one has to ask, right?
The debate is still raging on. It's going to be unresolved. It is assuming that we will all somehow build a consensus around this issue. That, I think, will be difficult because there is a cultural war that is waging in this country and it is unresolved. We'll leave it at this. Thank you very much for watching this edition of Crux.